The sun was just rising over Atlanta's Hartsfield-Jackson Airport, painting the sky in soft orange and gold. The morning air was filled with the sound of rolling suitcases, boarding calls, and sleepy passengers clutching their coffee cups. It was a normal Monday morning, the kind of day that promised nothing unusual. Among the crowd stood Angela and David Turner, a calm, confident black couple in their early 40s. Angela wore a navy blue blazer and held her phone and passport neatly in one hand. David, tall and steady, carried a black leather briefcase and a small suitcase. They had done this many times before, traveling together for work, keeping a low profile and always polite. They weren't just any travelers, though. They were inspectors for the Federal Aviation Administration, the FAA. They often flew unannounced to check on airline operations, flight safety, and crew professionalism. Today's flight was one of those quiet inspections. Nothing dramatic, no flashing badges, no official notice. They were just another couple on a flight to Chicago. Or so everyone thought as they moved through the airport. Angela smiled at the staff and nodded to other passengers. She loved airports, the energy, the motion, the small stories happening everywhere, David. More reserved, focused on time, making sure they arrived at the gate before boarding began. When the boarding announcement came over the speakers, they joined the short line for first-class passengers. A few people glanced at them, quick looks that seemed curious but slightly uncomfortable. Angela noticed but said nothing. She was used to it over the years. They had both learned to stay composed, even when people questioned whether they belonged in certain spaces. At the gate, the attendant scanned their tickets. "Good morning, Mr. and Mrs. Turner. Enjoy your flight," she said cheerfully. Angela smiled and thanked her. It was all smooth and normal. They walked down the jet bridge side by side, the hum of the engines in the background inside the plane. The first-class cabin smelled faintly of coffee and disinfectant. The seats were wide and clean, and soft music played overhead. David helped Angela store her bag in the overhead compartment, then placed his briefcase under the seat. They settled in, buckled up, and exchanged a quiet smile. It was shaping up to be an easy flight. But not everyone saw it that way across the aisle. A middle-aged man in a business suit gave them a puzzled look. His brow furrowed slightly as he glanced at their seats. Angela caught the look. She ignored it, pulling out a magazine from the seat pocket. David closed his eyes for a moment, trying to relax before takeoff. The flight attendants began their usual routine, offering welcome drinks and greeting passengers. One of them, a young woman with a polite smile, paused for just a moment when she saw Angela and David. Her expression flickered. Surprise. Then confusion. Then the practiced grin returned. She nodded and moved on, but Angela noticed. She always noticed. David leaned toward her and whispered softly, "It's okay. Let's just enjoy the flight." Angela nodded, though a familiar ache touched her chest. They had faced this too many times before. That quick doubt. That silent question of whether they fit where they were. Still, they reminded themselves why they were here. They were professionals doing their job, and nothing about this trip was out of place. The boarding continued. People shuffled down the aisle, storing their bags, searching for their seats. A family with 2 children laughed quietly. A businessman typed furiously on his laptop. Everything felt normal again. Angela looked out the window, watching as airport workers guided luggage carts across the tarmac. The morning light shimmered on the metal wings. Just then, a soft announcement came through the cabin. "Ladies and gentlemen, welcome aboard Flight 219 to Chicago. We'll be departing shortly." The crew's voices were calm and friendly. Angela took a deep breath. She always felt a small thrill before takeoff. The idea of rising above the clouds never lost its magic. David opened a small notepad, jotting down details for their report. Nothing seemed out of the ordinary still. There was a quiet tension building, not loud or obvious, just a subtle shift in energy a few rows back. A flight attendant whispered something to another crew member, glancing briefly toward the Turners' seats. Angela caught the movement from the corner of her eye but didn't react. She had learned that patience was often the best defense. As the plane's door closed and the engines hummed louder, Angela leaned her head back, her thoughts drifting to the meeting ahead in Chicago. She didn't know that this simple, peaceful moment was about to change completely within minutes. This calm flight would become a test, not just of their patience, but of the system they represented. For now, though, everything looked perfectly ordinary. A man in the next seat scrolled through his phone. A flight attendant checked seatbelts, and the captain's voice came over the speaker with a friendly tone. "Good morning, folks. We're cleared for departure." David smiled faintly. unaware that their calm professionalism would soon be put to the ultimate test. As the plane began to taxi down the runway, Angela reached for David's hand. He squeezed it gently. They had done this countless times before, but this time, neither of them could predict how quickly the flight would turn from a quiet routine to a story that would make national headlines. The engines roared, the plane lifted off, and the city of Atlanta grew smaller below in the cabin. Everything seemed peaceful. But fate was already waiting just a few thousand feet ahead, ready to test the calm, the patience, and the dignity of two people who carried more authority than anyone around them could imagine. The plane was in the air, gliding smoothly through soft white clouds. Sunlight poured through the small oval windows, painting everything in a warm golden glow. The hum of the engines was steady, calm, almost comforting. Angela and David sat quietly, each lost in thought, unaware that silent eyes were watching them from across the cabin. It started with small things, barely noticeable to anyone who wasn't paying attention. A passenger 2 rows behind leaned forward a little too often, pretending to adjust his seatbelt but really trying to take another look at the couple in first class. A woman across the aisle glanced up from her tablet every few minutes, her gaze quick and curious as if trying to understand something that didn't fit in her mind. Angela felt it first, she always did, that slow, invisible tightening in the air. Like a whisper without words, she turned slightly, pretending to reach for her drink, and saw the man in the business suit still staring at them. His eyes flicked away the moment she noticed. She looked down, her smile polite but tired. She had seen that expression many times before. Disbelief mixed with suspicion. David sensed it too. He glanced around the cabin, scanning faces the way trained professionals do, calm, quiet, reading the room without reacting. Most passengers looked normal, lost in their own worlds, but a few seemed unusually aware of them, as if they couldn't understand why a black couple was sitting in the front of the plane. He leaned closer to Angela and whispered, "Ignore it. We've seen worse," she nodded slightly. "I know," she said softly, "but it never gets easier." The flight attendant came by with a tray of drinks. Her smile was polite but tense. She served the passengers in front of them first, then turned to Angela and David. "Can I get you something to drink?" she asked, her tone bright but her eyes uneasy. Angela asked for water. David ordered coffee. Simple, normal, nothing unusual. Yet the attendant hesitated for a split second before writing it down, as if second-guessing what she'd heard. Then she nodded quickly and walked away. Angela looked out the window again. The clouds below looked like endless cotton fields, soft and endless. She wanted to lose herself in that peace, to forget the looks, the tension, the unspoken questions. But the cabin was too small for that. Prejudice didn't need words, it lived in glances, in pauses, in the way people shifted their weight or avoided eye contact. When the drinks arrived, the same attendant returned. She handed David his coffee first, careful not to make contact, then gave Angela her water. "Here you go," she said, still smiling. But the warmth didn't reach her eyes. Angela thanked her politely, but she noticed the quick way the attendant left right after, almost as if relieved to move on. Across the aisle, a passenger whispered something to his seatmate. They both chuckled quietly, trying to look discreet. David caught the movement in the reflection of the window. His jaw tightened for just a moment, but he said nothing. He had learned long ago that silence often spoke louder than words. The captain's voice came over the intercom, cheerful and professional. "Ladies and gentlemen, we're cruising at 34,000 feet. Smooth skies ahead." The passengers relaxed. A few laughed softly. Angela smiled faintly. For a moment it felt normal again, safe again. But only for a moment. A different flight attendant, older, more experienced, walked through the cabin. She gave the Turners a brief look, then leaned down to whisper something to the younger attendant. Whatever she said made the younger woman's eyes widen slightly. Then she nodded. They both glanced toward Angela and David again before walking to the galley. Angela and David exchanged a look, the kind that says everything without words. She sighed quietly. "It's starting again," she murmured. David nodded. "Just keep calm, we know how this goes." A few minutes later, the younger attendant returned, her smile a little too bright now. "Excuse me," she began. "Can I please see your boarding passes again?" Her tone was polite, but her voice carried a nervous edge. Angela blinked in surprise. "Is something wrong?" she asked. The attendant hesitated. "Oh, it's just a routine check, just making sure everyone's in the correct seats." David's eyes narrowed slightly. He handed over the boarding pass without a word. The attendant glanced at it, frowned, then at her tablet, then back again as if something didn't match the picture in her mind. "You're seated in first class?" she asked softly, her words careful but heavy. Angela replied calmly, "Yes, that's correct." The attendant nodded quickly. "Okay, thank you," she said, but her voice trembled just a little. As she walked away, Angela exhaled slowly. She looked at David, her voice low. "She didn't believe us." David shook his head. "No, she didn't," he said quietly. "But that's not our problem." Still, the atmosphere had changed. The whispers spread like tiny sparks. One or two passengers glanced back now and then, pretending to stretch or adjust their seats. But curiosity glimmered in their eyes. Angela felt heat rise in her chest, not from anger but from the familiar sting of unfairness. She turned her face to the window again. The clouds looked peaceful, untouched, free of judgment. She thought of how many times she had faced this. In stores, in meetings, even at restaurants where people assumed she didn't belong, and now, here, 30,000 feet above the ground, she still had to prove herself, still had to justify her presence in a seat she had every right to occupy. David reached over and gently touched her hand, his voice low and steady. "Remember why we're here," he said. "We're here to observe, not react." She nodded. The professionalism returned to her eyes, calm and composed. She smiled faintly. "You're right." But deep down, both of them knew. This wasn't over. The glances, the whispers, the doubt. It was building toward something bigger. The kind of moment that would test their patience, their dignity, and even their roles as FAA inspectors. For now, though, they sat quietly, side by side, holding their composure while the subtle stares continued, invisible chains in a sky that was supposed to be free. The flight had been calm for a while. The engines hummed softly, and the cabin lights glowed a soft yellow. Outside, the sky stretched endlessly. Blue and silent, Angela sipped her water and tried to relax, but her thoughts kept circling back to the uneasy looks and whispered words. Something didn't feel right. David was reading the in-flight magazine when he noticed movement near the front of the cabin. The young flight attendant, the same one who had asked to see their boarding passes earlier, was walking back down the aisle, her expression tight, her steps quick. She stopped a few rows ahead and spoke quietly with another crew member. Both of them kept glancing in Angela and David's direction. Angela's stomach tightened. She didn't want to assume the worst, but experience had taught her to recognize the signs. Quiet conversations, glances, the shift in tone. She leaned slightly toward David, her voice calm but firm. "Something's coming," she whispered. David nodded slowly without looking up. "I see it too," he said. The attendant approached, trying to smile, but the tension in her voice betrayed her. "Excuse me," she began softly. "Mr. and Mrs. Turner, could I please speak with you for a moment?" Angela blinked. "Is there a problem?" she asked. "I just need to confirm something," the attendant replied quickly, avoiding their eyes. David straightened in his seat, his tone calm and polite. "We've already shown our tickets," he said. "Is there an issue with our seats?" The attendant hesitated, clutching her tablet a little tighter. "Well," she began, "we've had a report that maybe you're seated in the wrong cabin," she said carefully, as if choosing her words like stepping over glass. Angela frowned. "That's not correct," she said, her voice steady but edged with disbelief. "These are our assigned seats, first class, 2A and 2B. She held up her digital boarding pass. The flight attendant nodded quickly but didn't look at it. "Yes, I understand, but we just need to verify again." David's voice stayed calm but firm. "You already verified it," he said, "twice." His tone wasn't angry, but it carried quiet authority, the kind that made people stop and listen. A few nearby passengers turned their heads, sensing tension. The air in the cabin seemed to tighten. The attendant took a small step back. "I'm sorry for the inconvenience," she said, "but the lead attendant asked me to recheck. Could you please come with me for a moment?" Angela's eyes widened slightly. You want us to leave our seats? She asked. Just for a quick verification, the attendant said, her voice trembling slightly. Angela looked at David. Their eyes met. A silent exchange of frustration and understanding. They knew what this was. It wasn't about seats. It was about doubt, the kind that had followed them for years in different forms. David took a deep breath and stood. Fine, he said quietly. Let's get this over with. Angela followed, keeping her posture straight, graceful. As they stepped into the aisle, whispers rippled through the cabin. Someone muttered, "What's going on?" Another voice whispered, "Maybe they tried to sneak into first class." Angela heard it but kept walking, her face calm but her heart heavy. She had done nothing wrong, yet here she was, being escorted off a plane like a suspect. At the front of the cabin, the lead flight attendant waited, her expression polite but cold. "Good afternoon," she said. "I just need to confirm your travel information." She held out her hand for their passes. David handed his phone over without a word. She glanced at the screen, frowned, then looked at the couple. "I see," she said slowly. "But these appear to be first-class tickets." Her tone carried disbelief instead of apology. Angela blinked in confusion. "Because they are," she said softly. "That's what we booked." The lead attendant exchanged a quick look with the younger one, then said, "All right, just wait here, we'll have to double-check with the gate." She walked toward the cockpit phone, murmuring into it. David exhaled slowly, his patience thinning. Angela folded her arms, watching the other passengers peek curiously from their seats. The humiliation was quiet but deep. Minutes later, the lead attendant returned. "I'm sorry," she said, though her voice didn't sound sorry at all. "But until we confirm this, you'll have to step off the aircraft." Angela's eyes widened. "Step off the plane?" she repeated softly. "We've done nothing wrong." David's tone sharpened slightly. "We have paid first-class tickets," he said. "We were cleared at boarding. This is unacceptable." The attendant stiffened. "Sir, please lower your voice," she said quickly, glancing toward the cockpit. "We're just following procedure." Angela could feel every eye in the cabin on them. The whispers were louder now. One passenger muttered, "Some people just try to act important." Another sighed impatiently, "Can we just go already?" The sting of judgment burned under her calm exterior, but she held her ground. "We're not leaving this plane until you show us a reason," she said, her voice calm but firm. The lead attendant's face hardened. "Then I'll have to call security," she said, and without waiting for a response, she picked up the intercom. David closed his eyes for a moment, breathing deeply. "All right," he said quietly. "Let them call whoever they need." Angela nodded. "We've got nothing to hide." Moments later, 2 airline staff members entered from the jet bridge, one of them wearing a supervisor badge. "What seems to be the issue here?" he asked, his tone neutral but cautious. The lead attendant spoke first. "They're seated in first class, but we can't verify their booking." The supervisor turned to Angela and David. "Can I see your IDs and tickets, please?" Angela handed over her phone again, her voice steady. "Here you go." The supervisor looked at the screen, then frowned. "These are valid," he said quietly, looking back at the attendant. "They're in the right seats." The young attendant's face paled slightly. The lead attendant frowned, clearly uncomfortable. "Well, we just wanted to be sure," she said, her tone defensive. But the damage was already done. The entire first-class cabin had witnessed the scene. Angela stood quietly, her dignity intact, but her heart heavy. David simply said, "We'll take our seats." His voice was low, steady, final. They turned and walked back to 2A and 2B, their steps calm but powerful. Behind them, the attendants exchanged nervous looks, whispering quietly. They didn't know yet who Angela and David really were. They had no idea that the 2 passengers they had just embarrassed were not ordinary travelers, but federal aviation inspectors, people with the authority to review and report every part of that flight. The confrontation was over, but the real consequences were just beginning. The air inside the cabin felt heavier now. Silence filled the space between the passengers. The hum of the engines could barely cover the tension that had settled in. Angela and David sat quietly in their seats, but their calm faces couldn't hide the sting that burned inside them. They had just been accused, doubted, and nearly forced off a plane for no reason other than someone's disbelief. David's hands rested on his lap. His fingers still, his mind turning, Angela stared straight ahead, her reflection visible in the window beside her. She didn't move, didn't speak. She had learned long ago that silence sometimes spoke louder than defense. But deep inside, a mix of anger and sadness twisted in her chest. The flight attendants whispered near the galley, their voices low but their eyes darting toward the couple. One of them bit her lip nervously, another sighed as if frustrated but unsure why. They thought they had done their job. They didn't realize they had crossed a line that couldn't be erased with an apology. Around them, other passengers had started murmuring, curiosity mixed with judgment. A few of them were recording quietly on their phones, pretending to check messages while capturing the awkward scene. A man in business class shook his head and muttered, "You see things like this all the time?" Another woman whispered to her friend, "They didn't look like they belonged here anyway." Angela heard it. Her jaw tightened, but she stayed still. Her fingers curled slightly around the edge of her armrest. David turned his head slightly toward the window. His reflection looked calm, but his eyes were full of quiet fire. He knew they couldn't react, not yet, not here. A few rows ahead, a mother leaned down and whispered to her teenage son. "Just mind your business," she said softly. But her eyes, full of sympathy, lingered on Angela for a moment, as if silently apologizing for what she had just witnessed. The captain's voice came over the intercom, cheerful but tense. "Ladies and gentlemen, we're just resolving a small issue. Thank you for your patience." His words were meant to calm, but they only fueled the quiet buzz of conversation across the cabin. The lead flight attendant returned, her face tight, her voice clipped. "Mr. and Mrs. Turner," she said softly, "we're sorry for the inconvenience. You may remain seated." Angela looked up at her. "That's it?" she asked quietly. "We were pulled out of our seats, humiliated in front of everyone, and that's all." The attendant hesitated. "I'm very sorry, ma'am. We just had to follow protocol." David's calm tone returned, but now it carried weight. "Protocol?" he repeated slowly. "Or prejudice?" His words were quiet, but they landed hard. The attendant's lips parted, but no answer came. She stepped back quickly and murmured, "I'll get the manager to speak with you after landing," then hurried away. Angela turned her head, looking around the cabin. A few passengers looked away when she met their eyes. Others just stared, unsure what to do. She could feel their discomfort, but not one person spoke up. Not one voice said this was wrong. David leaned back slowly, closing his eyes for a moment. "You okay?" he asked softly. Angela nodded. "I'm fine," she whispered. Though her heart was anything but fine, she felt exposed, stripped of dignity, not because of anything she did, but because of how others chose to see her. The flight continued in heavy silence. No one laughed, no one spoke loudly. Even the attendants' smiles looked forced now. The plane cut through the sky, thousands of feet above the ground, but for Angela and David, it felt like being buried under the weight of a quiet injustice. A man sitting diagonally across from them leaned over slightly, his voice low. "I'm sorry for what happened," he said. "That wasn't right." Angela managed a small smile. "Thank you," she said softly. He nodded once and turned back to his seat. Embarrassed halfway through the flight, a senior crew member came by, her expression calm but apologetic. "Mr. and Mrs. Turner, I want to personally apologize for earlier," she said. "It appears there was a misunderstanding." David looked up. "A misunderstanding?" he asked. "You mean assuming we didn't belong here?" The woman's face tightened. "Sir, I understand your frustration," she said quickly, "and we'll make sure to file a report about this." Angela's voice was steady. "No, you won't," she said, "because this kind of thing happens all the time, and nobody does anything." She wasn't angry anymore. She was tired, deeply tired. The woman nodded weakly, unable to argue, and walked away. The rest of the flight passed slowly. The clouds outside drifted like white sheets, the city below invisible. Angela kept her gaze fixed on the horizon, her mind running through everything that had just happened. David opened his notebook, writing a few quiet notes, words meant for an official report later, when the captain finally announced their descent into Chicago. The cabin filled with the rustle of seatbelts and shuffling bags. Angela took a deep breath, ready to leave behind the cold eyes and fake smiles. But she knew the story wasn't over. Not yet. As the plane touched down, The wheels screeched softly against the runway. The passengers clapped half-heartedly, and the attendants began their rehearsed goodbyes. Angela and David waited until most of the cabin had emptied before standing. They gathered their things slowly, their movements calm, controlled. When they reached the front of the plane, the lead attendant tried to smile. "Thank you for flying with us," she said. Her voice small. Angela met her eyes for just a moment, then said quietly, "You'll be hearing from us," and walked away. Outside the gate, the couple stood together in the terminal, the buzz of travelers all around them. David looked at Angela, his voice calm. "They thought they were humiliating us," he said. "But they just humiliated themselves," Angela nodded. "Now," she said, "we make it official." Neither of them raised their voice. Neither of them looked angry, but both carried a quiet power, the kind that didn't need to shout to be heard. The humiliation was public, but the justice that followed would be even more powerful, and this time it wouldn't be silent. The moment Angela and David stepped off the plane, the world outside seemed louder, busier and colder. People moved quickly through the Chicago terminal, phones in hand, rolling luggage trailing behind them. But for the couple, time felt slower, heavier, as if the humiliation from the flight still clung to their clothes. Angela adjusted her blazer, her face calm but her eyes sharp. David walked beside her in silence, his mind already shifting from passenger mode to professional. The inspector in him was awake now, the part of him that had seen pilots suspended, airlines fined, and crews retrained for far less serious mistakes. They walked together toward a quiet corner near the terminal's exit. David opened his briefcase and took out a small black folder. Inside were 2 government-issued badges shining faintly under the fluorescent lights. Federal Aviation Administration, the letters etched in silver, the same authority that oversaw every pilot, plane, and airline in the country. Angela took a deep breath. "We were supposed to be anonymous today," she said softly. "But maybe this is exactly why we're here." David nodded. "Sometimes," he said quietly, "the truth finds you whether you're looking for it or not." They approached the gate counter where the same supervisor from earlier was still standing. He looked up and froze when he saw them. "Oh, hello again," he said, his tone cautious. "Was there another issue?" David didn't smile. He placed his badge on the counter gently but firmly. "Inspector David Turner, FAA," he said. "This is Inspector Angela Turner." The man's expression changed instantly. Color drained from his face. "FAA, sir, he stammered, but David continued. "We were conducting a routine travel assessment. Off-duty, but still within our jurisdiction. Your crew just violated several federal standards for passenger treatment and discrimination," Angela added, her tone calm but razor-sharp. "And they did it in front of witnesses." The supervisor swallowed hard, glancing around nervously. I wasn't aware," he said weakly. "If we had known—" Angela interrupted gently. "That's the point," she said. "You shouldn't have to know who someone is to treat them with respect." He nodded quickly, his voice small now. Of course, please. Just give us a moment." He picked up the phone with trembling hands, calling someone from operations within minutes. 2 uniformed airline managers appeared, their faces tight with confusion. They approached cautiously. "Good afternoon," one said. "We understand there's a situation." David showed his badge again, his words steady. "Yes, there's a situation. Your crew detained and embarrassed 2 first-class passengers based on assumptions. They questioned verified tickets, delayed departure procedures, and called for security without justification." The managers exchanged worried looks. One of them began to apologize. "We're deeply sorry, sir." "This must have been a misunderstanding." Angela shook her head slowly. "No," she said. "It was a decision, a conscious one." Her voice was calm, but every word hit like a hammer. The younger manager tried to recover. "We'll open an internal review immediately, of course. And the crew will be suspended pending investigation." David nodded. "Good, but we'll also be filing an official FAA report. Your airline will be contacted by our regional office within 48 hours. The older manager stepped forward, his face pale. "Please, Inspector Turner." "Mrs. Turner," he said nervously, "let us make this right. We'll offer full compensation." "A public apology." Angela raised her hand slightly, stopping him. "We're not interested in compensation," she said quietly. "We're interested in accountability." A small crowd had begun to gather nearby. Airport staff, flight crew, and a few passengers from the same flight who had recognized them. Whispers rippled through the air. Someone said, "They're government inspectors?" Another muttered, "Oh, they're in serious trouble now." The lead flight attendant from the plane walked into the gate area. Her confidence gone, her face pale. She saw Angela and David and froze. The young attendant followed behind, eyes wide with shock. They hadn't been told who their passengers were. They approached slowly, the older attendant's voice shaking. "Sir, ma'am, I didn't know, I swear." "If I had known." David looked at her calmly. "That's the second time today someone said that," he said. "You shouldn't treat people with respect because of who they are. You should treat them with respect because it's right." Angela's voice softened, but her words still carried power. "You didn't just embarrass two passengers," she said. "You embarrassed your airline, your uniform, and the values you're supposed to represent." The attendant's eyes filled with tears. The young one whispered, "I'm so sorry," but the damage had already been done. The managers escorted the attendants away quietly, their badges removed for the time being. The crowd slowly dispersed, leaving Angela and David standing in the quiet space by the window. Planes taking off one after another in the distance. Angela looked out at the runway, her reflection faint against the glass. "You know," she said softly, "we've written dozens of reports, seen all kinds of misconduct. But this one feels different," David nodded. "Because this one was personal," he said, "and because it tells a bigger story." They walked slowly toward the exit, their steps measured, their presence composed. Reporters hadn't heard the story yet. No one outside that terminal knew what had just happened. But soon they would. The truth had a way of flying faster than any airplane. Outside, the sun was setting. Streaks of orange and purple painted the sky. Angela took one last look at the planes. "Sometimes," she said softly, "justice doesn't need noise. It just needs proof." David smiled faintly. "And we've got plenty of that," he said, tapping the notebook in his hand, filled with details, times, and names. As they walked toward the parking lot, the airport loudspeaker echoed another boarding call. Life at the terminal carried on as usual. No one realized that two quiet passengers had just shaken an entire airline from the inside out. They didn't raise their voices. They didn't seek revenge. They simply did their jobs, with dignity, with patience, and with power that came not from anger, but from truth. The twist wasn't that they were inspectors. The real twist was that they had turned discrimination into accountability, and silence into change. The news spread faster than anyone expected. Before Angela and David even reached their hotel, the airline's corporate office was already on high alert. Words like incident, FAA, and discrimination were echoing through urgent phone calls and flashing across internal emails. What had started as a quiet confrontation on one flight had now become a crisis in motion. At the Chicago terminal, the two managers who had spoken with the Turners earlier stood in a glass-walled office, pale and anxious. They were on a call with the airline's regional director, her voice sharp and impatient. "You're telling me," she said, "that our crew removed federal inspectors from a first-class cabin?" Her tone rose with disbelief. "Do you have any idea what that means?" The managers exchanged nervous glances. "It wasn't intentional," one said quickly. The attendants didn't know who they were, but the director cut him off. "That's the problem," she snapped. "They shouldn't need to know who they are to act professionally." Her voice softened slightly. "I want every crew member involved suspended immediately." Meanwhile, back at the hotel, Angela sat by the window with her laptop open, typing the formal report. Her words were calm but precise, each sentence capturing the timeline, tone, and behavior of the crew. David read aloud from his notes, adding details about passenger reactions, voice levels, and exact phrases used by the attendants. They worked like a team of surgeons, quiet, focused, and deliberate. Outside, Chicago's night lights flickered against the skyline. Angela paused for a moment, staring at the city below. "Do you think this will actually change anything?" she asked softly. David looked up. "Maybe not overnight," he said, "but it'll make noise. The kind that can't be ignored by morning." Their report was on the desks of both the FAA's Civil Rights Division and the airline's Compliance Department. A full investigation had been ordered. Emails with subject lines like urgent FAA incident, priority review, circulated through upper management. The airline's legal team was already awake, drafting statements and trying to control the damage. At the same time, whispers began spreading online. A passenger who had filmed part of the confrontation posted the clip on social media. The video showed Angela and David standing calmly as attendants questioned them. The caption read, "They kicked this black couple off first class and turns out they work for the FAA." Within hours, it had tens of thousands of views by midday. Major news outlets had picked up the story. Headlines flooded timelines. Airline faces backlash after mistreating FAA inspectors. First-class bias when prejudice meets authority. Talk shows began discussing it, and the airline's public relations team went into overdrive, crafting apologies, releasing statements, and promising a full investigation. Inside the airline's headquarters, the CEO sat in a tense meeting with senior executives. "We can't afford this kind of mistake," she said firmly. "Not now, not ever. I want the names of everyone on that flight. And I want diversity and bias training rolled out by the end of the month." Her voice carried across the room. No one dared to interrupt. The lead flight attendant, now at home, sat frozen as her phone buzzed nonstop. Messages from coworkers, screenshots of news articles, and even angry comments from strangers. She had never imagined her actions would reach this far. She stared at her reflection in the dark TV screen, tears welling in her eyes, whispering to herself, "What have I done?" At the same time, David received a call from an FAA official. "We've reviewed your initial report," the voice said. "Excellent documentation. We'll be moving forward with disciplinary recommendations, and the Department of Transportation has requested a briefing." David thanked him and hung up, his expression calm but satisfied. Angela looked at him. "So it's official," she said. "They're under investigation." David nodded slowly. "Yes, and not just them," he said. "This will affect policies, not just people." Later that afternoon, a representative from the airline knocked on their hotel door. A middle-aged woman in a navy suit, her posture respectful, her voice soft. "Mr. and Mrs. Turner, I'm here on behalf of the company to offer our sincerest apologies," she said. "We've already removed the crew from active duty, and we'd like to discuss how we can make this right." Angela listened quietly, then spoke with calm authority. "What's done can't be undone," she said. "But you can make sure it doesn't happen again. Every person who boards your aircraft deserves dignity, not suspicion." The woman nodded earnestly. "You have my word, ma'am," she said the next day. The airline announced a mandatory retraining program for all employees, focusing on bias awareness and customer treatment. News anchors discussed it across channels, calling it a turning point in aviation ethics. But Angela and David stayed silent. Declining all interviews, they weren't looking for attention. They were looking for progress. That evening, the two of them sat together in the hotel lounge. Watching the news coverage quietly, the headline flashed again and again, their faces blurred for privacy. But their story now belonged to the world. Angela sipped her tea and said softly, "Funny how a small act of disrespect can shake such a big system." David smiled faintly. "That's because truth is heavier than lies," he said. "And when it drops, it makes noise across the country." People talked about the story, flight attendants, passengers, corporate employees. Everyone had an opinion. But somewhere between the anger and the apologies, a real conversation had begun, one about equality, professionalism, and the danger of judging by sight by the end of the week. The airline issued an official letter to the FAA, acknowledging the inspector's treatment and promising systemic reform. It wasn't perfect, but it was a start. Angela folded the letter carefully and placed it in her file. "Not bad for one flight," she said with a small smile. David chuckled softly. "One flight," he said, "and a lifetime of lessons." Outside, another plane roared into the night sky, disappearing into the clouds. It was just another flight for most people. But for Angela and David, it was a reminder. That change, like flight itself, often begins with turbulence and ends with altitude. Days passed, but the storm didn't calm. What started as one flight's quiet injustice had now become a nationwide conversation. News anchors, radio hosts, and online voices all wanted to know the same thing. How could trained airline staff humiliate two passengers so easily? And worse, not realize those passengers were FAA inspectors.
At the airline's headquarters, an emergency meeting was called.
The boardroom was filled with tension. Executives, lawyers, and PR managers sat around a long glass table. Laptops open, papers scattered everywhere. The CEO entered with a serious face. She didn't bother sitting. "We're in damage control mode," she said. "The FAA wants a full report within 48 hours. And the public is already demanding answers. A lawyer adjusted his glasses. We've reviewed the incident footage and crew statements, he said. The attendants admit they questioned the couple multiple times but claim they were following procedure. The CEO frowned. Procedure? She repeated. Discrimination isn't procedure. It's a failure. Meanwhile, at the FAA office in Chicago, Angela and David's report had sparked more than an investigation. It had triggered a full review of airline compliance nationwide. Inspectors across different regions were ordered to observe boarding behavior, passenger interactions, and crew communication patterns. What had happened on Flight 219 was no longer an isolated event. It was now a case study. Inside the airline's training department, a smaller team sat watching the incident video frame by frame. The moment the attendant's smile faded, the uncomfortable body language, the look of disbelief when she saw the Turners in first class. It was all there, clear as day. One trainer shook his head. You can hear the tone change halfway through, he said. It's subtle, but it's there. That's how bias sounds when it hides behind professionalism. Back in Atlanta, the crew members involved were placed on unpaid leave. Their phones buzzed constantly with messages, some from angry strangers, others from colleagues offering quiet sympathy. The lead flight attendant sat in her apartment, staring at her reflection, replaying that moment over and over. The embarrassment, the fear, the arrogance she hadn't realized she had shown. Tears filled her eyes as she whispered, I ruined everything. The younger attendant, on the other hand, wrote a long apology letter addressed to the Turners, her handwriting shaky but sincere. I made assumptions, she wrote, and I was wrong. I hope you can forgive me. But even if you don't, I've learned something I'll never forget. She placed it in an envelope, unsure if she'd ever have the courage to send it. At the FAA's main office, Angela sat across from a panel of senior officials reviewing her report. They asked detailed questions about the timeline, the crew's tone, and passenger reactions. Angela answered calmly, every word measured. David added his observations, his voice steady. Both of them professional as ever, but under their calmness was quiet pain, the kind that only comes from being disrespected despite doing everything right. One official, an older woman with kind eyes, nodded slowly. You handled it with dignity, she said softly, but it shouldn't have taken your authority for people to treat you with respect. Angela smiled faintly. That's exactly the point, she said later that week. The airline's internal investigation team arrived at FAA headquarters, bringing documents, statements, and a list of proposed corrective actions. They looked nervous, sweating under the weight of the meeting. The lead investigator began. We take full responsibility, he said, and we're committed to rebuilding trust. David leaned forward slightly, his tone calm but direct. Rebuilding starts with honesty, he said. Your crew didn't make a mistake. They made a choice. They looked at us, saw something they didn't expect, and acted on it. If you call that a misunderstanding, you'll never fix it. The room went silent for a moment. Only the soft hum of the air conditioner filled the space. The investigator nodded slowly. You're right, he admitted quietly. It was bias. And we're addressing it, Angela added gently. Good. Because one incident like this in the sky affects thousands on the ground. Her words hung in the air like truth carved in stone. By the next morning, internal emails leaked to the press. One headline read, Airline admits to racial bias in FAA inspector case. The story hit harder than ever before. Journalists camped outside the airline's offices. Former employees came forward with stories of similar experiences. Social media exploded again. People demanded accountability, not just apologies. Inside their hotel, Angela and David watched the coverage quietly. The news anchor's voice filled the room. The airline has confirmed disciplinary action and announced a nationwide retraining initiative following the FAA's investigation into a discrimination case involving two of its inspectors. Angela looked at David. We didn't even have to speak publicly, she said softly. The truth spoke for itself, David nodded. It always does, he said. Especially when it's written in the right report. He closed his notebook gently, satisfied that their professionalism had made more noise than anger ever could. That evening, the FAA administrator issued an official statement, praising the Turners for their composure and professionalism. It read, Their actions reflect the integrity and calm we expect from all federal officers, and their experience will guide policy improvements across the industry. At the same time, the airline's CEO faced the press, Cameras flashed as she stood at the podium. "We failed," she said plainly. "Not just the passengers, but the values we claim to stand for. Our employees are being retrained, our procedures rewritten, and our leadership reminded that humanity comes before hierarchy." The crowd went quiet. Her words echoed far beyond the room. That night, as the city lights glowed outside their window, Angela sat with a cup of tea. "You know," she said softly, "this might actually change something." David smiled. "Maybe for once it's not just talk," he said. "Maybe this time people will listen." Outside, planes rose into the night sky, their lights blinking against the darkness, each one carrying strangers with different stories. But somewhere inside every flight now, a new rule had taken root, that respect is not optional, and that a seat, whether first class or last row, never defines a person's worth. The internal review was over, but its echo had only just begun. The skies would never feel the same again. Weeks had passed since that unforgettable flight, yet its echo still lingered in the air like turbulence that refused to settle. Newspapers had printed headlines, the internet had shared opinions, and the airline had spoken countless apologies. But for Angela and David Turner, the real victory wasn't in the noise. It was in the quiet change that followed. The FAA had officially closed the investigation, their findings clear and public. The airline had violated professional conduct standards and displayed bias during a verified first-class boarding. It was more than just a mistake. It was a mirror reflecting what too many people already knew but rarely saw so clearly. The final report recommended mandatory inclusion training for all airline staff nationwide, and it carried both their names. Angela read the closing paragraph slowly, her voice calm but thoughtful. "It says here our report is being used as a model for new staff protocols," she said. David smiled faintly. "That's good," he replied. "Means it mattered." Back at the same airport weeks later, the Turners walked through the familiar halls of Hartsfield-Jackson, the same place where their journey had begun, the same place where quiet prejudice had tried to shrink them. But now things felt different. The staff seemed more attentive, more conscious. The smiles looked real this time, not just rehearsed. They weren't there to fly that day. They had come for a scheduled follow-up audit. Walking past the gates calmly, observing interactions, noting how crews greeted passengers, one attendant, seeing them approach, smiled warmly and said, "Good morning. Welcome aboard." The sincerity in her voice felt genuine. Angela nodded politely. "Good morning," she replied, and for once it didn't feel forced. Outside on the runway, a plane took off, its engines roaring through the bright morning sky. The sunlight danced on its wings, and Angela found herself watching it closely. "Funny," she said softly, "the sky never judges. It just carries whoever's willing to rise." David glanced at her and smiled. "That's because the sky doesn't see color," he said, "only altitude." Later that afternoon, they attended a meeting with airline executives. This time, the tone was entirely different. The CEO stood before them, her voice steady but respectful. "Mr. and Mrs. Turner," she began, "we've completed the retraining program for our crews, and we owe much of it to the lessons learned from your experience." She paused, looking genuinely remorseful. "It shouldn't have taken an incident like that for us to remember what respect really means." Angela nodded. "Accountability is the beginning of trust," she said quietly. "As long as this change continues, something good came from something painful." The CEO exhaled softly. "It will," she promised. "It has to." In the following weeks, airlines across the country began reviewing their own staff behavior policies. Some introduced empathy programs, others added courses on cultural awareness and unconscious bias. The Turners' case had become a benchmark, not just in aviation, but in leadership training, equality seminars, and even college ethics classes. Despite all that, Angela and David stayed out of the spotlight. They refused interview requests, declined public speaking events, and ignored brand offers. They didn't want to be famous. They wanted fairness. One quiet evening, sitting on their porch under a soft pink sky, Angela said, "You know, people keep calling us heroes." David chuckled. "Heroes?" He repeated, "No, we just did our job," and refused to be small. She smiled at that. "Sometimes," she said softly. "That's all it takes." The incident had changed them too. It had reminded them why they joined the FAA in the first place: to protect, to ensure safety and integrity, not just for machines and metal, but for the people who trusted the sky. Angela often thought about the passengers on that flight, The ones who stayed silent. The one man who whispered an apology. She hoped they too had learned something that day, even if just to see people differently. Months later, a letter arrived in their mailbox. Handwritten, no return address. Angela opened it and began to read, her eyes softened. It was from the younger flight attendant, the one who had asked to see their boarding passes. "Dear Mr. and Mrs. Turner," it began. "I still think about that day every single morning. It taught me more than any training ever could. I've changed. I see people differently now. I'm trying to be better." Angela's eyes shimmered. She handed it to David without a word. He read it slowly and smiled. "That's the real lesson," he said quietly. "Change that starts from guilt but ends in growth." As the months turned into a year, the memory of that day began to fade from headlines, but its lesson stayed in policy and practice and in hearts. Every time a new crew member learned about respect and fairness, every time a passenger was greeted without judgment, a small piece of that story lived on. One spring morning, the Turners found themselves flying again, this time to Washington for a conference. As they boarded, a young attendant smiled brightly. "Welcome aboard, Mr. and Mrs. Turner," she said. "Thank you for flying with us," Angela returned the smile. "Thank you," she said gently and took her seat. David leaned toward her and whispered, "It feels different this time," she nodded. "It does," she said, because maybe the sky finally learned something too. As the engines roared to life and the plane lifted off, Angela looked down at the shrinking city below, her heart light for the first time in months. The clouds rolled beneath them like a sea of peace, and the sunlight glowed through the window. Warm and endless, high above the noise, high above the doubt. Two people who once faced humiliation now carried the quiet pride of change. They didn't fight with anger. They fought with grace, and that made all the difference. The world below kept moving, but somewhere in those skies, a lesson had been written, one that would travel farther than any plane ever could. And that lesson was simple, powerful, and true. Respect doesn't need a uniform, kindness doesn't need permission, and equality isn't earned, it's owed always to everyone.